Hello, everyone. I'm Koren Wong-Ervin, and this is a paper with Jorge Padilla and Judge Doug Ginsburg. Doug Ginsburg sends his regrets that he couldn't be here today. I am going to just very briefly introduce the paper and then turn it over to Jorge Padilla. So the idea for the paper came sort of in part from a conversation with Philip Marsden that I had on a panel in 2020. And I was describing what I think most of us would agree with, the idea that in dynamic markets, short-run monopoly power is a feature, not a bug. And Philip said, okay, fine, but we're not seeing short-run monopoly power. That in his view, the markets in which many of the leading platforms operate are characterized by, long-held high market shares. So at that panel in 2020, we had a lively debate about whether the relevant markets were properly defined, with my view being that in many of these cases against so-called big tech, the markets are artificially narrow, and that's where you get the high shares. So, and we've heard this from others, different reports saying that companies like Google have become essentially sort of lazy monopolists, and any R&D they're doing is about creating barriers to entry. So in a conversation with Jorge Padilla and Judge Ginsburg, Jorge had the great idea to focus on R&D. We're not going to have agreement on relevant markets, though it's pretty entrenched to different views. So let's set that aside. Let's assume that the markets are properly defined and that there's high shares for some of these leading tech companies. And then let's say, okay, well, let's look at R&D. And so that's what we do. We look at R&D and we examine whether R&D has, what has happened to R&D? Has it decreased since 2000? Which one would expect if the markets in which these companies operate were no longer characterized by dynamic competition. And so before I turn over to Jorge to present the findings and some of the background, I'll just address what some of you may be thinking, and that's this contention that why do we care? I was on a panel recently with Fiona Scott Morton, and she said, that it's irrelevant whether these companies are engaging in R&D unless we can know what the but-for world was. And in her view, and the view of others, that if the markets that these companies operate were more fragmented, we would see not only more innovation, but we would see different types of innovation. And so just to kind of put that out there in the beginning, why do we care? I think that, our view is that it's really incumbent upon those claiming that the but-for world would have been better to show that. And so unless you can show that the R&D that's occurred is of no value and is all about creating barriers to entry, then I think we still care very much about R&D. With that, I'll turn it over to Jorge.
Thank you, Koren. So this is about dynamic competition. This is about R&D. And from a more abstract perspective, this is about the extent to which we should adapt the legal rules and the standards that we use in antitrust in industries that we call dynamically competitive. That is, industries where competition is through innovation and competition takes place sequentially for the market. And in particular, to make it more concrete, the question is, in those industries where there is dynamic competition, where competition takes place through, say, a series of innovation sequence of innovation races, whether we care about market structure in the short term, whether we care about market shares, whether we care about concentration indices. And what we are trying to do is to confront three different perspectives, and to confront those three different perspectives using data, using empirical analysis. And using empirical analysis for the observed world. Of course, we don't have data for a potential counterfactual world. So these three views are what we term the dynamic competition school, what I would call the mainstream school of thought, and what I will refer to, if I can manage, as the neo-Brandesians. And in order to save time and also, inspired by the presentation from Aurélien, I think I'm going to refer to science and astrophysics as a way of distinguishing these three schools. The dynamic competition school is one that says, in these markets, we don't care really about how much matter we observe, because there is a lot of dark matter. That dark matter are potential entrants. And one cannot understand how the universe operates without taking into consideration the dark matter. One cannot understand competition in those markets if one doesn't take into account that there are potential entrants who we may not be able to name, that's why it is dark matter, who may not be observed at this point in time, but whose presence is felt in the way that the planets, the matter, behaves, the companies that are in the market behave. And therefore, this school tells us, don't care. We don't care about short-run market structure. We don't care about short-run monopoly, because there is all that dark matter outside that influences and determines how the players in the market operate. Many economists, and I call this, to simplify the mainstream school, would say, well, there may be dark matter. And this dark matter may, in principle, have an impact. But that impact in the markets at which you are looking at is unlikely to be determinative, is unlikely to make a difference. And the reason is because in those markets that you call dynamically competitive, that is, those in which there are innovation races, those markets are also characterized by other factors, like network effects, economies of scale and scope, switching costs, that make entry ineffective. And so there may be dark matter out there. They might be like the gas that Chris was mentioning before, but it doesn't really condition the behavior of the matter that we observe, the planets. Now, whether that is true or not depends on how high are the barriers to entry that are affected by those switching costs, network effects, economies of scale and scope, and what is the potential that those for entrants to overcome those barriers to entry through innovation, and that depends on the type of innovation that is possible and the extent to which the innovators can displace the incumbents if they are able to leapfrog them and jump over those barriers to entry. So whether or not dark matter matters is a question, an empirical question. And finally, you have the neo-Brandesians. And the neo-Brandesians are telling us there is no dark matter. And if there is, we don't care. All that matters is what we observe. And yes, there may be planets information, but we only care about them when they are formed, when they look like a sphere, when they obviously condition the behavior of the other planets, and we can see that. We may have faith on many things, but we don't have faith in the dark matter, because possibly it doesn't exist. And so what matters is market structure today. And both the mainstream school and the Brandesians, actually, they seem to be saying, look, a market cannot be defined as dynamically competitive because it's structured as a series of innovation races for the market. A market should be regarded as dynamically competitive if it exhibits action-reaction. Let me just move there. If it exhibits action-reaction, that is, action-reaction is what? Would be a situation in which you observe fluctuations in market shares. The market leader today loses market share to its competitors. The competitors win market share. So there is, if you look at the evolution of market share over time, there is exhibits reversion to the mean. It's the picture that you have on the left-hand side of this screen. Market shares fluctuate around a mean. So in other words, what they're telling us is a market is dynamically competitive if I can see that monopoly is transient. And if I don't see action-reaction, then I conclude that that market, even if it's structured as innovation races and it's a market where innovation is king and prices and quality are of second-order importance, is not dynamically competitive. Whereas the dynamic competition school says I don't care whether what you observe in terms of the evolution of market shares is action-reaction or increasing dominance. And the reason behind that we don't care, that the explanation behind that statement, is that in a market that is structured in terms of innovation races, in the market defined as dynamically competitive in the sense of the dynamic competition school, you can have increasing dominance, and at the same time, you can have a lot of innovation. You could have good outcomes in a context with a market structure that not only remains concentrated, but where concentration increases over time to the point that you may have monopoly. In fact, there are a number of conditions under which you would expect that in a market structured as such, as innovation races for the market, the outcome should be increasing dominance. And those circumstances are those in which the dark matter is really credible in its influence on actual behavior. If when entry occurs, that leads to a very significant increase in competition, then the established players, those that we observe, the planets that are formed, are going to invest significant amounts of money in order to protect their rents. And in fact, contrary to the static arrow effect, what you could see is that in that world, it is the incumbents, it is the large players that have rents to protect that are going to invest more than the small players, or even those that are out there, information in the dark matter. And this is important and explains why that those potential entrants, what I'm calling dark matter, can have a significant influence on market behavior, rendering the structure of the market irrelevant. So if we want to determine, let me just see what I can get. If we want to determine which of the three explanations works, which one is vindicated by the facts, by the data, it is useless to focus on the evolution of market structure. It is irrelevant to observe whether there is market reaction, action reaction, or increasing dominance. What we need to look at is whether the conduct is consistent with the presence and existence of potential entry of that dark matter or not. We cannot identify dark matter through observation. We're not going to say, oh, look, that is the dark matter. But we can see whether it exists because it affects the way that companies behave in the marketplace. We infer its existence from the conduct of the incumbents. If incumbents behave as if they are facing much more competition that one is able to measure through market structure, through measures of market share, and is because there is something out there that is conditioning them. That's the dark matter, that's the potential entrant. So we should investigate the innovation efforts of the incumbents and see how those innovation efforts relate to, for example, the market share, the scale of operation, whether they continue investing and increase the level of investment when the market tips in their favor, whether they are investing as much as you would expect in industries where indeed entry is palpable and is not just a potential, or whether on the contrary, they are behaving as monopolies operating in markets where we are certain that matter doesn't exist, that potential competition is of no relevance. Markets that are static, where innovation is not that key. And this idea, that is the idea of preemptive innovation, is an idea that Rich referred to before, and in fact, we have to credit him for developing one of the first papers, if not the first paper, pointing this idea. Has limitations, of course. We cannot simply infer from the fact that the market is structured as a series of innovation races that potential competition is going to be effective. There are conditions where that is likely to happen and conditions where that may not occur, where preemptive innovation may be significant and conditions where preemptive innovation may not be that important. Now, that is why we need to look at empirical data, and then we need to see, and identify markets that we regard as dynamically competitive, innovation races for the market, and see whether the conduct in those markets is consistent with the dynamic competition school, with the preemptive innovation story, or not. That would also help us understand whether the theory that Rich and others have presented is vindicated by the facts, whether what we observe is that there are certain dynamic markets where market structure matters and others where it doesn't matter, and what distinguishes one set of markets from the other. Let me just jump in the interest of time. So what we have done in this paper is to look at the evolution of R&D expenditures in absolute terms, but more importantly, normalized by revenues, for 25 firms in 5 sectors, 5 firms per sector. We have looked at the mamas, the big tech companies. We have looked at big software and B2B tech companies. We have looked at pharmaceutical companies, automotive companies, and other manufacturing companies. Why 25? Well, we were restricted in terms of time and also data availability. But what we intended is to look at the largest firms in each of these sectors, focus on sectors where innovation is important, but sectors that can be distinguished in terms of the relevance of that innovation. From pharmaceutical markets, where innovation is of utmost importance, and it is essential to bring new innovations to the market if you want to remain there, and a new innovation can displace you altogether, to dynamically competitive markets in the way that they are structured, where we don't know whether that dark matter is working or not, the mamas and the B2B tech and software companies, and other sectors where there is innovation as well, but where we wouldn't classify them as markets where competition is for the market, but markets or sectors where competition is in the market, and they are not dynamically competitive as such, like automotive companies and manufacturing and the manufacturing sector. Next slide, if I can. It doesn't seem to be working. I'm not sure exactly what I need to point out. Okay. Good. So the data that we have is financial data. It's data coming from 10Ks. It's good data, but it has limitations for the purposes of our analysis. On the one hand, sometimes cost of acquisitions or the cost of IPOs may be recorded as R&D. There may be differences in the classification of R&D spending across firms, especially when the firms are headquartered in different jurisdictions. What qualifies as R&D expenditures may vary over time and also across industries. And we don't know whether the R&D that is being recorded is productive or it was just developed in order to create barriers to entry. So there are limitations, and we acknowledge them in the paper. But let me show you what the data shows again. So this figure plots over time R&D expenditure as a proportion of revenue between 2000 and 2022 for the mamas, or GAFAs, as you want, the big tech companies. The line in the middle, which I can see it's difficult to observe from where you are, which is the purple one, is the weighted average of these figures for the different companies. And what you can see is that the R&D ratio, the R&D to revenues ratio, peaked around 2004, 2005, went down somewhat, but then came back. What we don't see is secular decline. We don't see a downward trend, despite the fact that all these companies increase their market share, increase their presence in their respective markets, and using static measures of market power, increase their market power to the point that some of them may have become or may be now identified as quasi-monopolies by the competition agencies. The precise dynamics of the ratio is hard to explain, and it may vary from one of the firms to the other. The peak in 2005 may be because all these companies had, bigger opportunities for innovation earlier on in their lives. Also, they were, operating at lower scales, and therefore they had more difficulties in defraying the fixed cost of R&D over revenues. But eventually what we observe, especially in recent years, is that all of them, if not, most of them, if not all of them, have increased the R&D expenditure ratio quite significantly. You could say that some of them have responded to actual entry, like Meta with TikTok. You could say that all of them are responding to the competitive pressure that comes from the others who may be penetrating their markets. So again, I'm having difficulties. There may be different explanations for that, and we cannot rule them out. We cannot rule out that it's actual entry as opposed to the dark matter that is having an effect. We cannot rule out that there is the potential constraint imposed by regulators, and that the threat of regulatory intervention has led these companies to behave more aggressively. But it seems difficult to believe that that's all that is happening, because there are some of these big tech companies that didn't face actual, or that have not faced actual entry, and it seems difficult to believe that recent regulatory interventions may have had such a dynamic and significant impact on business strategy. The behavior seems more consistent with the existence of competitive threats, and that force these companies to act not as idle monopolists, but as effective competitors, responding to a threat that may be difficult to identify at a point in time, but it exists there. And that may be more credible because it's probabilistic as opposed to certain, because you don't know where the threat comes from, and because you may end up, as somebody has said, concluding that don't wait to be cannibalized, it's better to cannibalize yourself, which is just the opposite, as I mentioned, of the logic of the static arrow effect. We have tried to isolate some of the potential criticisms. For example, we have tried to look at whether the evolution of the R&D ratio that I presented can be explained by acquisitions. And the graph is difficult to see from where you are. We have looked at that. We conclude that acquisitions don't explain the evolution of the R&D ratio. There are a number of things, as I said before, that we can not really explain. And we are not able to determine whether the innovation that we observe, these R&D expenses, are meant to bring to the market new products and services, or are developing barriers to entry. That we cannot do, and I would have to be conservative there. But again, and as Koren mentioned before, it seems to us that that is not for us. That would be for somebody that wants to rebut this evidence to look into. What we have done as well is to compare the R&D ratio for the 5 sectors that I mentioned before, trying to see whether the evolution of the R&D ratio for the big techs and the B2B and software companies is more similar to the pharmaceutical companies or more similar to those other companies, those other sectors that I consider not dynamically competitive. And the evolution shows that B2B software and the mamas and the big techs R&D ratios are much more similar to those of the pharmaceutical sector, where we all would recognize that dynamic competition is key, than the other sectors that whereas investing, don't see innovation as existential in the same way. So what is the conclusion? The conclusion from this evidence has to be careful and conservative. We're looking at only 25 firms. We're looking only at R&D ratio. We don't have the possibility of digging into the R&D to determine what kind of R&D is that. But this evidence doesn't seem to endorse the view that there is no dark matter and that all that matters is short-term market structure, because we don't see the R&D ratio going down as market share increases or when quasi-monopoly is achieved. And it is also telling us that dark matter, whatever its origin, seems to have an impact, and the threat of entry is sufficient to overcome the feeling of protection that network effects, economies of scale and scope may afford. And therefore, it really suggests, with all the caveats that I mentioned in mind, that indeed we need to be careful in drawing implications that competition in these markets is not working, that competition in dynamically competitive markets is not in operation simply because we don't observe action-reaction, because we don't see transient market power. And that all those proposals that seek to reinvigorate the use of structural presumptions lack foundation when applying to this type of markets and should be seen with greater skepticism. Now, I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to stop here so that I can allow the discussant to have sufficient time. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for the paper, interesting paper, Jorge, Doug, and Koren. This is a very interesting paper and fitting to the discussion we're having today. We had a lot of discussion about theory and a welcome addition of an empirical study. The authors point out there's nothing wrong with successful firms competing fairly in the market and taking high market share. In fact, we probably don't do enough to celebrate successful firms winning, when that's the very core of what makes America America, capitalism at work. Winner take all is not necessarily an indication of market failure, the authors argue. And the paper rightfully argues that high market shares in high-tech markets are often blamed for lack of innovation, but that's short-sighted. They argue that testing the dynamic competition hypothesis requires an investigation of the innovation effects of the market leaders over time, hence the dynamic competition, and they really point towards R&D expenditures. I actually was reminded of Meta. It reported the first quarter earnings yesterday. They beat the market expectations, but soon after the call, the stock plunged as low as 19%. And the reason was that Mark Zuckerberg said that they are considering raising the R&D expenditures on AI from 19 billion last year to somewhere between 26 and 30 billion, almost almost doubling. So I was reminded of that because it looks like investors took that as a sign of weakness, that in the AI race, Meta is doing catch-up. It's interesting because is that a sign of weakness or sign that the market is working and that even a big player, big tech player, is incentivized to continue to invest in R&D, continue to innovate, which in that case it would be a good thing. And obviously, anyways, that's just an interesting food for thought. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I really enjoyed also the delving into the R&D expenditure ratios over time, and also looking at that through the eyes of M&A, major acquisitions that happened over time, whether or not there is a correlation. And you said there wasn't. And I was reminded of course, Felipe Aguinon's inverse U-shape between innovation and competition, because R&D as a ratio could be sort of viewed as an innovation measure. And I'm interested to know, perhaps, maybe that's something we could do across different industries, the 5 industries, try to look at the relationship between, the association between innovation and competition across different industries, maybe over time, whether or not, what's the dynamic there over time. So those are some of my thoughts, immediate thoughts that came to my mind. But thank you so much for the amazing work.
So thank you very much for your comments. I think that actually the observation about Meta is quite interesting. It shows that the way that I read that evidence, or that anecdote or anecdotal evidence, is that indeed the investors feel that in the new world of AI, Meta is going to face significant competition. They may not be able to pinpoint who's going to be the competitor, but they may. But I think that reaction reflects the fact that they believe that perhaps other big tech companies or outsiders will be able to challenge Meta's position. I think that for decades, or at least for many years, we thought that nothing was happening in the search engine world, and suddenly in a couple of weeks, paraphrasing Lenin, in a couple of weeks the world has moved as it would in decades. And I think that this is precisely what we're trying to capture with our analysis, that there is conduct and there is behavior and there are market outcomes that you cannot understand if you don't think in terms of the existence of potential competition, that cannot be explained on the basis of actual movements in market share and in market structure. The last thing I would like to say about this paper is that, in my opinion, is the first chapter, the introductory chapter of a nice research project. I think that it opens many more questions that it resolves. It points in a certain direction, but I think that we need to look at the evolution of R&D and at the company level with a greater degree of granularity. And there are a number of potential diff-in-diff analyses that could be conducted that would be tremendously helpful. Looking, for example, at how Meta responded in terms of R&D to TikTok, how it is responding to the AI threat, how its R&D ratio was actually unaffected by the acquisition of Instagram. What does it tell us? And what are the inferences that we can draw from all those facts? And then, to the extent possible, complementing this data with other data so that we can, instead of looking at charts, we can do proper regression analysis to try to isolate the effect of observable factors, so that, the so-called, this would be the equivalent of the solar residual, the dark matter residual, using Aurelian's terminology, can be identified with a little bit more precision.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question? Of course, in the telecommunications sector a few decades ago, Bell Labs was huge in R&D. I don't know if that was an indication of good innovation or bad innovation. And then fast forward a little bit to pre-iPhone, Samsung, Nokia, Siemens. It was a very competitive, it was a well-protected industry until the iPhone came about. And so what is your thought about R&D expenditure in those two specific cases?
I think that that's an interesting case study, and is one that is typically used in order to claim that in a counterfactual in which we would have more fragmented companies, there would be more innovation, that the fragmentation of AT&T was the reason that spared considerable innovation in telecoms and led to, among other things, the emergence of the internet. I'm skeptical about that, to tell you the truth. It's a potential explanation, but I think that I would like to see that analysis conducted more transparently, because I think that there are many other intervening factors in between, and it would need to be controlled. The same I would say about our own empirical analysis, so I'm not using double standards. I think that it's an interesting fact that is suggestive in some respect, that we may need to worry about the counterfactual that Koren was mentioning before, but I think that further evidence would be required. I think that, however, the point is who bears the burden of proof in each case if we move from the realm of the scientific inquiry to litigation, okay? And I think that in the case of litigation about market power in dynamically competitive industries, it's for the plaintiffs to argue that the evidence that has been presented here today is of no value.
Thank you.